It is splendid to have shared in the greatest day of the century. Try and see it through my eyes. I rode up to the hill where the King of Prussia was standing, bathed in the last rays of the setting sun. Beneath lay the picturesque castle, the remnants of the French army locked up inside it. The German armies formed a wide circle all around, now resting after the bloody fighting and shouting continually in triumph, "The Emperor is captured." The adjutants run around, choruses start up, and the batteries thunder out world history, the greatness of Germany. The next morning, my dear, I saw the punishment of God. The defeated emperor, seated before a little house, and around him huge Prussian cuirassier guards, protecting rather than watching over him. God's ways are wonderful indeed. That is an extract of a letter written by Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin to his wife Isabella from the battlefield of Sedan, fought on the 1st and 2nd of September 1870. The defeated emperor is none other than Napoleon III of France, captured, humiliated, and soon to be sent off into exile in, of all places, Chislehurst in South London. Sedan was the critical battle of the Franco-Prussian War, which saw the end of the French Empire and the establishment of a united Germany under Emperor Wilhelm I, the King of Prussia. The letter shows many aspects of Count von Zeppelin's character: his patriotism, his love of the military, his joy in a victory that he describes as not just a Prussian success, but one shared by all the German states. It also demonstrates, in the Count's vivid, clear descriptions of what he saw, a certain poetic, maybe even romantic nature. We have the sense of someone who reflects deeply on his experiences and on the world around him. Count von Zeppelin's name is synonymous with airships, even today. I've described before how I saw an airship fly over my school at the age of 8. It was a little blimp, a non-rigid airship advertising Mazda cars. And afterwards, I asked one of the older boys if he'd seen the Zeppelin that morning. "That wasn't a Zeppelin, you little idiot," he replied, with the kindness children so often show to each other. Over 124 years since the flight of the first Zeppelin, and the name still resonates. The nature of the man himself, though, is in danger of becoming lost to history. Like many of the characters in the Airship saga, Ferdinand von Zeppelin's personal story is little known. I suspect even those who do know of him don't actually know that much beyond the photographs of a genial, smiling, walrus-moustached old gentleman in a white yachting cap, the mad scientist inventor of the rigid airship. Maybe some assume him to be a literal Colonel Blimp, a bombastic, jingoistic, militaristic character hell-bent on German domination. The reality is far more interesting. Ferdinand von Zeppelin was a man of great intellect and a strong moral compass, given to deep thought and reflection. His diary, which he kept from the age of 24 right up until his death in 1917 at the age of 78, runs to many thousands of pages and contains detailed reflections on the political, cultural, social, and religious challenges of the turbulent times in which he lived. Not just an astute observer of events, von Zeppelin was an active participant in them. He was a brave soldier, a gifted diplomat, a trusted advisor to kings, princes, and generals. He was also a man of remarkable vision and singular determination, who, when the door of his military career was cruelly slammed shut in his face, forced open the window of the airship business which ultimately became his life's work. It's impossible to overstate how much the loss of his military career affected the Count, and how much it spurred him on to success in his airship endeavours. Henry Courtmeyer calls it massive psychological compensation. Whatever his motivation, the Count saw the infinite possibilities of aviation and, armed with absolute faith in his vision, overcame enormous financial, engineering, and political challenges to realise his dream of flight and to found a company that would go on to create some of the most iconic aircraft in history. This is the story of Count von Zeppelin and his vision of the rigid airship. Welcome to Upship, the Airship History Podcast. I'm Nick Rogers, your captain on this long-haul flight through the fascinating history of airships. Before we continue, please accept my apologies for the long gap between episodes. I've been busy with work and with a number of other projects, some of which are related to airships, so watch this space for more information. In the last two episodes, we traced the life and work of Brazilian airship pioneer Alberto Santos Dumont, who himself became a figure of international renown. This episode, we turn to a titan of the airship world, and in fact the aviation world in general, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, inventor of the rigid airship, and a man whose very name is forever associated with lighter than air flight. There is so much to say about Count von Zeppelin and his work, and in future episodes we will come back and back many times to him and to the company he founded, a company that, by the way, still exists and still manufactures airships. Von Zeppelin very much led a life of two halves, and in this episode we'll look at the first part of his life, his career as a soldier and diplomat, and then the events that led to the construction and operation of his first airship, the LZ-1. Before we get into the episode, a very quick note on my sources. My main sources for this episode were Count von Zeppelin by Hugo Eckener, Giants in the Sky by Douglas Robinson, Airships in International Affairs by John Duggan and Henry Cordmeyer, and Airshipman, Businessman and Politics by Henry Cordmeyer. And now, on with the story. The Zeppelins are an ancient, adventurous, militaristic family. Originally from Mecklenburg in North Germany, where a tiny village still bears the family name, two of the brothers moved south to serve the Duke of Wurttemberg, later elevated to King of Wurttemberg, in the late 1700s, and they were both made counts in recognition of their talents and service. Although the Zeppelins were a martial family, Ferdinand's father, Friedrich Jerome von Zeppelin, opted for a career as a manufacturer and an official in the court of the King of Wurttemberg, while tending his estates at Gersberg, a rather delightful spot not far from the shores of Lake Constance, comprising acres of fields, woods, and lakes. And it was into this idyllic, aristocratic environment that Ferdinand von Zeppelin was born on the 8th of July, 1838. Hugo Eckener opens his biography of the Count with a description of a 5.5-year-old Ferdinand written by his mother, in which she praises his skill at pitching in with the work of the farms, milking cows, weeding gardens, carrying woods and stones, that sort of thing. She notes an unusual interest in the machinery of the farm, which actually reminds me of the young Alberto Santos Dumont, and she even detects the stirrings of an early patriotism, saying that the boy is proud of being a Württemberger. It sounds like a rather wonderful childhood. Young Ferdinand seems to have enjoyed an awful lot of freedom, which is a little counterintuitive given all the stereotypes of stern, grim, duty-bound German aristocrats. He swam in the lakes, rode his pony across his father's estate, and pitched in with the work of the farms. Ferdinand's father was a kind and gentle man, interested in botany, poetry, and the effective management of his land. His mother, Amelie, was a known beauty and an outgoing, funny woman who disliked having to manage the farm when her husband was away. During one such absence, she wrote to him about a difficult decision she had to make, saying, "How I shall be glad to hand back to you the reins of government. Governing is not in my line. I don't understand it, and when things go wrong, all I want is to throw my scepter at people's heads." I think we can all sympathise with that. This perfect, nurturing environment for young Ferdinand was shattered for him at the age of 13 when his mother died. Care of the boy passed to his father, and for the rest of their lives, father and son had an unusually close relationship. At around this time, perhaps because of the emotions stirred up by his mother's death, perhaps because his own tutor was a clergyman, Ferdinand, throughout his life a deeply religious person, expressed a desire to become a missionary. His father opposed this, though, and at the age of 17, Ferdinand enrolled in military school, following in the footsteps of many of his illustrious martial ancestors. Hugo Eckener paints a picture of his student life that we would recognise today, drinking, having fun, and making friends, but it was a student life interrupted in 1859 by the Second Italian War of Independence, fought between France and Austria, and one of a very confusing array of conflicts and wars in the second half of the 19th century. Ferdinand was posted to Ulm and later to Ludwigsburg, where 2 years of garrison life gradually ground down this rather restless and active person. It's here that he decided to take a sort of military gap year. 3 years, in fact, in which he travelled incessantly. Heading to Vienna, he met the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I. Then he went to Genoa and Marseille, and then to Paris, where he met another emperor, Napoleon III, who had actually spent much of his childhood at his mother's castle on Lake Constance. These travels were eye-opening from a cultural point of view, but his main objective was to learn about the militaries of these great nations. It's clear that Ferdinand's excellent social connections, along with his outgoing, friendly personality and his keen intellect, opened many doors. After Paris, he visited Belgium, England, and Denmark. And while in London, he undertook a detailed inspection of the British military, and he wondered about the military situation in the world's other great English-speaking nation, the United States, at that time engaged in a bloody civil war. Applying to the King of Wurttemberg for a year's leave, he approached his father for permission to visit America, which at first the old count was extremely reluctant to give, and he explained why in a lengthy letter to his son. I have all my days regarded life in America as quite unworthy of admiration and sympathy, and that your choice has fallen upon a country and a people whom I have never placed at a high level, since their politics and morality seem to me to exclude them from playing a worthy part in civilization or pursuing the divine ideal and mission of human improvement. That seems to me a rather unfairly damning verdict on the United States. Ferdinand, who had gone so far as to learn English, persisted. He needed to make this trip, to see a serious war unfolding before his eyes, to satisfy himself on a moral level that his choice of a military career was ethical and that would give his life the meaning that he craved. His father relented, and Ferdinand left for America on a Cunard steamer in April 1863. The trip was formative for the young soldier. On arrival in the United States, he secured an audience with Abraham Lincoln. Just think, in the space of a year, this young man had met 2 emperors and a president, who he described as a very tall, spare figure with a large head and long, untidy hair and beard, exceptionally prominent cheekbones, but wise and kindly eyes. Lincoln gave Ferdinand a pass that allowed him to act as an observer in the Union armies. On his very first day, he found himself in the midst of an action in Virginia, shells falling all around him. He showed that he hadn't changed that much since his school days, saying that I was soon very well known at headquarters, especially at the canteen bar, where visitors to the camp were always cordially welcome. I will admit that I seldom refused an invitation. During the opening moves of what was to become the Gettysburg Campaign, Ferdinand accompanied a cavalry reconnaissance party attacked by Confederate troops who shot directly at him. He escaped without firing back, having to remind himself that he was merely an observer and had no right to take an active part in the combat. It was at this point that he broke off his military activities in order to take part in an expedition aimed at finding the source of the Mississippi River in the Northwest. During this adventure, the Count had the opportunity to ascend in a balloon in St. Paul, an experience I covered in a previous episode. Returning home in late 1863, he picked up his military career and, in 1865, was appointed as adjutant to Charles, the King of Wurttemberg. In this role, which gave constant access to the king, Ferdinand was able to develop his political and diplomatic skills. Initially, he was rather shocked by the state of the king's court and by the king himself, who boasted that he never read a newspaper and who received all his information from a narrow group of courtiers. For an intellectually curious man like Ferdinand, this was almost unbelievable. These were politically fraught times for the German states. Germany, as the country we know now, did not exist. Rather, the map was a bewildering patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities, dominated by the Kingdom of Prussia to the north and the Empire of Austria to the south. After the Napoleonic Wars, these 39 states had been bound together in a loose, ineffectual association called the German Confederation. This was nominally headed by Austria, but the whole setup failed to take account of the increasing power, dominance, and ambition of the Kingdom of Prussia. Prussia's Prime Minister was the ruthlessly brilliant Otto von Bismarck, who was single-mindedly devoted to the notion of German unification under Prussian dominance. In 1862, he gave a notorious speech in which he said the solution to German unification would come about not through talking and voting, but through iron and blood. Bismarck was prepared to achieve his objectives through force, and not for nothing was he known as the Iron Chancellor. There had already been conflicts. In 1864, Bismarck had engineered a war with Denmark over the so-called Schleswig-Holstein question, an incredibly arcane, obscure set of diplomatic issues relating to the status of the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein on the Danish-German border. The problem was so complex that the British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston said only 3 people have ever really understood the Schleswig-Holstein business: the Prince Consort, who is dead, a German professor who has gone mad, and I, who have forgotten all about it. The War of 1864 was a catastrophic defeat for Denmark. But in early 1865, when Ferdinand took up his role with the King of Wurttemberg, tensions over the peace settlement at the end of the war were already rising between Austria and Prussia. Wurttemberg, being a southern German state, was closely bound to Austria, and Ferdinand was scathing about Prussian heavy-handedness, saying anyone who wishes to add to Prussia's might at the cost of Greater Germany must necessarily believe that Prussia is able and willing to represent the general interests of Germany. That this is not so is convincingly proved by history. Tensions broke out into war in June 1866. Prussia, Italy, and various northern German states versus Austria and various southern German states, including the Kingdom of Wurttemberg. Captain von Zeppelin was posted to the staff of the general commanding the Wurttemberg division, some 7,000 men. He was not impressed by the state of the Wurttemberg troops, believing them to have lower morale and lower discipline than their Prussian enemies. He himself acted with courage throughout the short war, once almost drowning in the River Main while swimming across in full uniform to communicate with friendly troops on the other side. The result was a crushing victory for Prussia, which ended the Austrian-led German Confederation and replaced it with the North German Confederation, confusing, I know, which was a Prussian-dominated group of North German states. Despite his previous antipathy towards Prussia, Ferdinand could see the way that the wind was blowing, and in his role as adjutant to the King of Wurttemberg, urged his monarch to build closer relations with the Northern German Confederation. But the king vacillated, pulled in both directions by his ministers. Ferdinand seems to have lost his patience with the hesitant king, and after a rather sharp discussion, decided to tender his resignation as an adjutant and requested a transfer. This was granted, and despite his disagreement with the king, Ferdinand left in high favour. He had requested a secondment to the Prussian General Staff in Berlin to better understand the Prussian army and the mindset of this ever-rising power. He received a warm reception from fellow officers, but realised that there was a general distrust of Württembergers, as well as an almost universal assumption of Prussia's superiority and destiny to dominate any German unification. He used his time in Berlin to study the Prussian army to add to his own significant and growing military expertise. But the King of Wurttemberg had further use for his former adjutant and appointed him as equerry to Prince William, the heir to the throne. This was a post that Ferdinand accepted only with trepidation. He was not impressed with Prince William, a dreamy, listless, poetic character who shied away from the grim reality of politics, sharp contrast to Ferdinand and his strong sense of duty. The young prince told his new mentor that he would actually refuse the crown when it finally came his way. Von Zeppelin worked to change the prince's attitude and to instill in him a sense of duty. He seems to have been successful. The prince went on to become king and was an important supporter for von Zeppelin's airship endeavours. It was around this time, the summer of 1869, that Ferdinand married. His wife was Isabella von Wolf, his sister-in-law's cousin, and this was a long, happy, productive and fulfilling partnership that, as Eckener says, stood the hardest tests the future held in store, and there were many. In July 1870, simmering tensions between France and Prussia, manipulated behind the scenes by Otto von Bismarck, who hoped that a war would unite the German states behind Prussia, boiled out into an outright war. And as Bismarck hoped, the German states were aghast at apparent French aggression and rallied to Prussia's side. Captain von Zeppelin was attached to the staff of the Württemberg Cavalry Brigade, and early in the war was to become famous for a daring reconnaissance 25 miles behind enemy lines, in which he and his narrow group of troopers were attacked by the French, the Count himself narrowly avoiding capture. He distinguished himself during the rest of the war. At the Battle of Sedan, before he penned the words to his wife that introduced this podcast, he led his men in cutting a key railway line. Taking part in the Siege of Paris, he saw the use of balloons, as described in a previous episode. The war ended in victory for Prussia and her allies. Otto von Bismarck's dream became a reality on the 18th of January 1871, when German unification was proclaimed in the Palace of Versailles, King Wilhelm of Prussia becoming emperor of a finally unified Germany. Von Zeppelin was pleased that the long-awaited union had taken place, but was still worried about what it might mean for smaller states such as Wurttemberg. The German Empire was a new reality for all concerned, and old feelings could not automatically be put to one side. The tensions, ambiguities, and contradictions generated by unification would simmer for decades, and, as we would see, would ultimately cost Ferdinand dearly. For now, von Zeppelin's military career continued, and he was given command in the cavalry. Promoted major in 1873 and colonel in 1884, he was a conscientious and kind-hearted commander who dedicated himself to the welfare and training of his men. As a consequence, he was beloved by his troops and sought after by junior officers wishing to serve under him. But his skills as a diplomat were in constant demand, and in 1885 the King of Wurttemberg appointed him military attaché at the kingdom's embassy in Berlin, and 2 years later von Zeppelin found himself Württemberg's ambassador and, at Bismarck's urging, a member of the Bundesrat, the upper house of the new German Empire's parliament. It was a heady and prestigious appointment. Count von Zeppelin found himself at the centre of Europe's newest empire, a powerful, rising nation. But it was also in this position, in his last official act as ambassador, in fact, that von Zeppelin was to transgress against the new regime and become, effectively, a marked man. The root cause was his attempt to deal with a problem of military politics and bureaucracy that was causing grief to Württemberg troops, the fact that a Prussian commanding officer could dictate the future of the Württemberg officers under his command. Von Zeppelin wrote a memorandum to the emperor in which he expressed his opinion that this was unconstitutional, and he proposed the establishment of a military cabinet in Wurttemberg. The emperor was distinctly unimpressed, writing in the margins that he was astonished at these particularist ideas. Although von Zeppelin's note eventually did lead to a change of policy, Ferdinand himself had blotted his copybook with the Prussian establishment beyond repair. He would come up in diplomatic gossip as being an anti-Prussian troublemaker, and from now on, whether he knew it or not, his days were numbered. Leaving his ambassadorial position, he was jubilant at being appointed commanding officer of the 30th Cavalry Brigade in March 1890, with the rank of Major General, and in September of that year, at the large autumn manoeuvres, was assigned command of a cavalry division, quite likely thinking that this would lead to even larger commands and even higher rank. But it was not to be. The Inspector General of Cavalry, a Prussian, General von Kleist, informed him that he had failed in the exercises, that he would never receive command of a division, and that in fact he was relieved of command of his brigade. He was promoted to Lieutenant General as a faint consolation prize, but knowing his military career had effectively been terminated, Count von Zeppelin retired from the army on the 29th of December, 1890. It was a crushing, public, humiliating blow. Throughout the whole of this episode so far, we've seen how devoted the Count was to his military and diplomatic career, and to the ideals of duty, service, and patriotism that it represented to him. He had dedicated himself to serving the Kingdom of Wurttemberg and to the German Empire that followed. Enjoying the support of kings, field marshals, and princes, he could have expected to soar to the very highest ranks of the armed forces. But in one stroke, all that was taken away from him. At the age of 52, this vigorous, energetic, dutiful, intelligent man found himself cast out, cut adrift, without purpose or employment. And worse, his good name had been blackened, his reputation tarnished by the court politics of the new German Empire. Lesser men would have accepted defeat and retreated to comfortable retirement. But not so Count Zeppelin. He determined to change and adapt to meet his new circumstances. As Henry Cordmeyer says, foremost would be a psychologically modified Count Zeppelin. Beneath his quiet and courtly demeanour would be a patriot even more fervent for his German Vaterland and even firmer in his Swabian loyalty. No one would trespass upon his sincerity or find him pliant again. But the question was, where should the Count channel his now directionless energies? The answer came in the form of a subject that had interested him for some years, the problem of human flight. And after the break, we will look at where the Count's interest came from and how he bounced back from the devastating career blow he had been dealt. Count Zeppelin was 52 when he was obliged to leave the army. Even for the average man, that is too early to settle down and enjoy a dignified leisure in comparative content. His involuntary retirement came upon Count von Zeppelin at an age when his extraordinary vitality and his mental and physical vigour made him feel positively young. His constitution was destined to retain its energy and activity into advanced old age. He was now entering upon that period of his life in which he was to realise his most decisive achievement. Hugo Eckener there, in a quote from his biography of Count von Zeppelin. Eckener is correct. Von Zeppelin would of course go on to invent the rigid airship and start a company that bears his name to this day. If his military career had continued, no one would ever have heard of him. He'd have been just another German general in a pointy helmet, likely retiring in obscurity before the outbreak of World War I. But at the end of 1890, down on his luck and thrown out of the army, von Zeppelin could have no inkling of this illustrious future. The question was, what should he do with all the vitality, vigour and energy that Eckener had observed? Well, there was one obvious outlet, one that was actually encouraged by his wife and daughter. For many years, the Count had been interested in the possibilities of airships, noting down thoughts and ideas in his diary. Eckener discounts the possibility that he was inspired by his balloon flight during the US Civil War, or by his observation of balloons during the Siege of Paris, but I'm not so sure. In episode 3, I quoted a letter from the Count to his father after his balloon flight, noting how the balloon was an ideal vantage point to observe enemy troops. It's difficult to believe that these experiments didn't have some impact. Wherever the interest was sparked, the first real ideas came to the Count in 1874. He attended a lecture given by Heinrich von Stephan, the German Empire's postmaster general and a far-sighted communications genius who would later go on to introduce the telephone to Germany. In his lecture, and in the pamphlet that accompanied it, von Stephan urged the development of German flying machines in order to speed up the delivery of mail. This call to action piqued the Count's interest. In a diary entry dated the 25th of March 1874, he jotted down his initial thoughts on what would eventually become the rigid airship. He says that the machine, as he calls it, should be the size of a big ship. He describes it as being flown using elevators, although he doesn't use that word, calling them wings. And he says that the gas should be stored in a number of separate chambers or cells that can be filled or emptied separately. The machine would be used to transport passengers. For someone with no direct experience of airships or aviation, these jottings reveal an extremely clear-sighted mind at work. Remember, this was 1874, barely 20 years after Henri Giffard's first flight. The handful of airships that had been built were small, slow, lumbering aircraft that could carry one or two people. The idea of a large airship with multiple gas cells transporting numerous people was genuinely new thinking. Over the next few years, the Count would idly jot down a few ideas here and there in his diary. But what catalysed him to greater action was a flight that we are familiar with on this podcast, the 1874 flight of Renard and Krebs' airship La France. If you think back to episode 3, this was the first time an airship had been able to take off, fly against the wind, and return to its point of origin. For a patriotic German like the Count, this success by the Empire's foundational enemy was a grave threat and an insult. After marshalling his thoughts in more diary entries, he broke cover and, whilst he was military attaché in Berlin, penned a memorandum to the King of Wurttemberg in May 1887. In his memorandum, he lamented the lack of progress Germany had made in military airships, as opposed to France, who he saw leaping ahead. The Prussian airship battalion existed, but he thought they were going in the wrong direction, pursuing tethered balloons that were really only useful for siege warfare, rather than steerable airships such as those that France was developing, which had a far greater range of uses. He said that a successful airship would need to remain aloft for at least 24 hours, which would enable it to make reconnaissance flights, lift troops, or drop bombs. Airships could also be used for transportation or for exploring the North Pole or in Africa. We don't know what, if anything, came of the memorandum, and the Count did nothing to further his ideas until June 1891, when, less than a year after he'd been forced out of the army, he wrote to Alfred von Schlieffen, chief of the German General Staff and author of the infamous Schlieffen Plan. The Count recalled a conversation he and von Schlieffen had had about airships during a ride in the Tiergarten. Von Zeppelin says that back then he did nothing to put his ideas into practice, partly for fear that he may have been, as he says, looked on even temporarily as candidate for a lunatic asylum. He goes on to state that such ridicule can now only hurt him personally, not the army in general, and that he is committed to pursuing the ideas he had been noting down all these years. He ended his note by asking von Schlieffen to send an expert to evaluate his ideas. Von Schlieffen obliged and sent an officer from the Prussian airship battalion, who encouraged von Zeppelin to continue his work, but to be honest, it seems to me that von Schlieffen may have been simply humiliating a former colleague who had been dealt a very public, very humiliating blow. But nothing could distract the Count from his new mission. If airships are possible at all, he wrote in his diary, then mine is possible. Despite his optimism, however, the Count was not an engineer. He had had some engineering training at Stuttgart years ago, but airship design was new territory for him, as it was, to be fair, for everyone else, and there were some early setbacks. The first problem the Count had to contend with will be familiar to listeners by now: power. Comparing his plans with Renard and Krebs' La France, the Count wanted to treble that airship's 13 or 14 miles an hour, and he hired engineer Theodor Gross to help him in developing a design. Their calculations revealed the two Daimler engines available to him would only be able to generate around 20 miles an hour. The airship could not carry more than two, because the weight of the additional engines added to the weight of the heavy rigid structure, the fabric hull, the gondolas and crew and so on would just be too great. He also met with friends over dinner one evening in July 1891, and they tried to dissuade him from pursuing airships and to join them in building aeroplanes. They were developing an aeroplane that would be launched via a pneumatic propulsion from a sort of gun fixed in place. This, they said, was the future, not the Count's madcap scheme. Heading home, depressed, the Count was ready to give up. But he mulled over the conversation, and he realised two things. One, that the idea of shooting an aeroplane from a gun was plain bonkers, and two, that mention during the dinner had been made of a lightweight petrol engine being developed that would provide enough power to get his airship moving. And another important factor weighed in his decision to press ahead: a newspaper report of further French airship tests. Writing to his engineer, the Count said, "We Germans must hurry up if we are not to be left behind." The work, therefore, continued. I get an impression at this time of the Count gripping this idea almost obsessively. In fact, there's no almost about it. He was undoubtedly obsessed by the possibilities he saw in his airship design, and frustrated at the fact that he couldn't get anyone else to see them. At this stage, he is forever writing to people, the head of the Prussian airship battalion, Daimler and others at his engine company, potential suppliers, potential supporters. He decided that Engineer Gross was overcautious, describing him as an obstacle in my path, and he sacked him and replaced him in May 1892 with a young engineer called Theodor Kober, who was to work for the Zeppelin enterprise for the rest of his life, and whose daughter Ilse would in fact go on to become one of the most significant female aeronautical engineers in history. Through the rest of 1892 and into the next year, the Count and Kober worked diligently to refine their calculations and improve the design. The Count was confident in what they had done, but he needed official government support for his project, support that had so far, frustratingly, not been forthcoming. At this stage, the Count's design was a rigid airship in the form of a sort of airship train. 3 separate structures, rigid frames containing individual gas bags, each structure covered by fabric, would be coupled together and act as a kind of locomotive and 2 carriages. The first structure would support the engines and crew, the next 2 would contain the payload. The Count wanted a committee of experts to sign off on the plans in the hope that full government support and, critically, funding might follow. But with bureaucracies, some things never change. The Count was trying to get something new added to a busy government agenda. Even back then, officials had diaries and work plans and hectic schedules. The easiest way for them to deal with abstract requests from slightly obsessive former army officers about radical new technologies was to just ignore them. So the Count wrote letter after letter after letter to the Ministry of War, to the Chief of Staff, to the Chief of the Army's Corps of Engineers. He even enlisted the King of Wurttemberg, always a supporter, to buttonhole the Emperor himself while he was in Stuttgart on an official visit. The pestering began to pay off. By November 1893, he had secured agreement from the Ministry of War to assemble a committee to examine the Count's ideas. In writing to thank them, he actually asked for funds to help finish his design and to start construction of an airship, saying that I could not be answerable to my family for adding this expense to what I have already incurred. But no funds were given. The wheels turned slowly. Agonizingly slowly. It wasn't until March 1894 that the committee finally met, and initially the Count would have been pleased by their findings. They agreed that his invention should be secured for the Reich. If there was one issue, said the chairman, it was perhaps that the metal framework could be strengthened. But who would pay for the changes in the design? The committee agreed the Count himself had already paid too much, but the War Ministry refused funds. And because of this, essentially because of internal bureaucratic politics, in July 1894, the committee rejected the Count's proposals. Infuriating. We can imagine the Count in the study of his castle near the shores of Lake Constance, pacing up and down and ranting about the idiots and narrow-minded bureaucrats in the War Office. Relations between the Count and the German army were strained for many years after this episode. Yet again, though, the Count did not give up. Funding the necessary design changes himself, he demanded that the committee be reconvened to study the matter again, writing to the Ministry of War, and even, in his diary at least, contemplating legal action against the government, which was probably not the most diplomatic idea. But in an almost unheard of move, the committee was indeed reconvened and met in December 1894 to look at the Count's ideas for a second time. And yet again they rejected them. We can sense the Count becoming enormously frustrated and downright angry with the German establishment's refusal to see the merit of his airship proposals. Furiously scribbling letters, he picked fights with committee members, wrote to the King of Wurttemberg, and even the Emperor, who, presumably in an attempt to shut this crazy old man up, gave him a grant of a paltry 6,000 marks. It was next to useless, but at this stage the Count really did need the money. A glimmer of hope was offered by the director of Krupp, a major German arms manufacturer and at that time one of the largest companies in Europe, who had been enlisted by one of Count von Zeppelin's allies at the Daimler Engine Company to give the Count's plans the once-over. The director thought the airship was a good idea and that it would be able to generate the right amount of speed to be military useful. The Count seized on this and began yet another letter-writing campaign with the War Ministry, who were, as ever, unmoved and still did not support him. Out of funds, rejected multiple times by the government, deserted by his friends, relying on a fast-dwindling handful of supporters, being branded a lunatic in the press, having names shouted at him in the street, being a source of public ridicule and pity. Would any listener have blamed the Count if he'd thrown in the towel at this point? But having seen his beloved army career taken away from him, the Count was not about to let his dream of airship flight go the same way. And in December 1896, he finally got a break. That June, he had been asked to address the Wurttemberg branch of the Union of German Engineers. Their interest piqued, their governing committee and the Count engaged in a back-and-forth correspondence until they felt prepared to issue a public endorsement of the Count's airship vision. They recommended that an airship of von Zeppelin's design should be constructed, and they appealed to German industrialists, many of whom were members of the Union, to come forward with the funds to make this happen, for fear of the country being eclipsed by France, America, or even, perish the thought, Great Britain. This endorsement and its appeal to German industrialists' sense of national honour worked, although it still took nearly 18 months to actually make progress. In May 1898, an organisation called the Joint Stock Company for the Promotion of Air Navigation was formed, with a few famous names involved. In addition to the Count and Karl Berg, who had provided the aluminium for the Schwarz airship discussed in episode 3, the one that looked like the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz, there was Daimler, of motorcar fame, Karl von Linde, the founder of the gas company that still bears his name, and Frederick Voigt of Voigt Group, still a major engineering firm. Despite these luminaries, there was clearly a fair amount of residual scepticism, because the Count himself had to put up almost half of the company's 800,000 mark capital. Nevertheless, finally, after almost a decade of campaigning, cajoling, scheming, begging and pleading, after writing countless letters and using up God knows how much ink, his relentless determination had paid off, and the Count was at last in a position to begin construction of his airship. The King of Wurttemberg granted von Zeppelin some land at Manzel, on the shores of Lake Constance just to the west of Friedrichshafen and across the water from the Count's estate. He decided to build and house his airship not on land, but rather on the water, and the first order of business was to construct a 500-foot-long wooden floating hangar out on the lake. The chief benefit of this was that the hangar could turn with the wind, making ground operations easier. The Count also thought it would be safer for all concerned, including local residents, to test this experimental new aircraft over the water. By this time, the design had evolved from the three-piece airtrain of 1895. Now there was just one structure, 128 metres long by 11 metres in diameter. For UK listeners, that's an aircraft slightly longer than the London Eye is tall, and more than 50 metres longer than a Boeing 747-400. It was powered by two 14.2 horsepower Daimler engines, which drove 4 propellers and contained just over 11,000 cubic metres of hydrogen. 2 small rudders provided directional control, and altitude was changed via a 100-kilogram lead weight suspended underneath the airship that could be winched fore or aft to change pitch. The gas lifted 2 gondolas forward and aft, which contained the engine equipment, while the propellers themselves were attached to the rigid structure of the hull. The gondolas were connected by an extremely narrow open walkway, suspended by wires, and you would not have wanted to walk along this during flight. The airship was also now referred to as LZ-1, Luftschiff Zeppelin No. 1, Zeppelin Airship No. 1. Even now, the going was tough. Shortly after the floating hangar was finished, it was damaged by bad weather. Repairs cost 100,000 out of the company's 800,000 mark capital. Delays in material added to the difficulties. By the time the airship was finished in January 1900, the company's funds were close to being depleted. The Count, keen to have some of the best possible conditions for the first flight, elected to wait until they had some decent summer weather before the maiden voyage. Originally scheduled for the 30th of June, bad weather forced a postponement despite the ballast bags being filled and other preparations being made. The same happened on the 1st of July. Again, the attempt was aborted because of the weather. We can only imagine how frustrated the Count must have been, so near yet so far, and how nervous he was that the same weather forcing him to delay could become worse and risk damaging the shed or the airship. The morning of the 2nd of July was the same story. Bad weather, flight postponed. But in the late afternoon and early evening of the 2nd of July, the weather finally cleared. This was it. The moment was upon them. The Count, clearly feeling the gravity of the moment, removed his hat and led the crowd in a short prayer. The airship, moored to a wooden raft which was slowly towed out into Lake Constant, emerged from its shed for the first time. The shore was crowded with people, eager to see what had been growing inside the gigantic wooden hangar. The surface of the lake was jammed with onlookers and small boats. Some of them had been waiting for the last few days for a glimpse of the airship in flight. Count von Zeppelin boarded the forward gondola with 2 crew members, with another 2 in the rear gondola. Captain Hans von Sigsfeld of the Prussian Airship Battalion took the controls, but one of the potential crew refused to board because the Count hadn't been able to find insurance. The large handling party on the floating platform watched the Count, awaiting his command, grasping the 2 gondolas to keep the ship from launching into the air. It came at 3 minutes past 8 in the evening. The Count looked down to the handling crew, paused, and called, "Cast off." The crew let go, and the airship began to rise, the nose pointing sharply upwards because the crew holding the rear gondola had hung on a little too long. The airship's crew operated the winch to bring the counterweight forward, and the nose dipped back down, the ship levelling out at around 400 metres over Lake Constance. Flying out over the lake, the airship moved slowly northwest as the crew grappled with the rather clunky controls. The winch operating the lead weight broke with it stuck in the forward position, pulling the nose down, and much ballast had to be dropped to keep the airship from nosing straight into the lake. And then one of the engines broke down. The whole structure was also visibly hogging, with the centre section rising above the bow and the stern, evidence of severe structural weakness. But it flew. After 15 minutes of flight, covering 3.5 miles distance, the Count gave the order to land on the water just off the shore of the town of Immenstadt. A motor launch came out to tow the airship back to the hangar, but it became entangled in some submerged structure and was damaged. It wasn't until 1 in the morning that she was safely back in the hangar, and the Count could breathe easy once again. Although undoubtedly getting the airship into the air at all after almost a decade's work was a triumph for the Count, the flight itself was only a qualified success. The Kaiser had sent a military commission to assess the airship's capabilities, and they reported that the LZ-1 was neither suitable for military nor non-military purposes. However, they saw it as a useful experimental aircraft which could be used to solve problems and test theories about airship flight. The Count set to work trying as best he could to repair the damage and address the deficiencies. The flimsy walkway was rebuilt as a proper metal keel to try and stiffen the structure. The lead weight was replaced with a heavier version, the rudders moved from the side of the hull to underneath it, and an elevator added to the nose to supplement the movable weight. The refitted airship was ready to go again by the end of September, but as listeners will now know, nothing is ever simple in the world of airships. On the night of the 24th of September, some of the rings that held up the airship suspended in its wooden hangar broke, allowing the middle section to come crashing to the floor. It could have been a lot worse. There could have been a fire, for example, but in the end repairs took 2 weeks, and with some further weather delays, the airship was finally ready for her second flight on the 17th of October. And this was far more successful. The flight lasted almost an hour and a half and covered nearly 7 miles, along the north coast of Lake Constance to Meersburg and then back to Manzel. Some minor drama occurred during the landing when the nose of the airship dipped sharply towards and actually ended up touching the water's surface, but the damage was slight and the airship was taken out for a third time on the 21st of October, where the Count really opened her up, and over the course of a flight of around 20 minutes, he obtained a speed of some 17 miles an hour, significantly beating the 3.7 miles an hour achieved by La France. Watching the 2 October flights was a young academic and freelance journalist, Dr. Hugo Eckener, sent down by the Frankfurter Zeitung because they didn't want to use a real reporter on covering these experiments. In Eckener's own words, he adopted a cool and critical tone in his story, observing that the airship's speed was not enough to counter even a moderate wind. And Eckener's skepticism was still shared by the Kaiser's experts. They still could not recommend spending public money on the LZ-1. It was a huge blow for the Count and must have been quite the come down after the elation of the test flights. The Company for the Promotion of Air Navigation had exhausted its capital. There was simply no more money for further experiments. The company liquidated, and the Count was on his own. Once again out of money, out of supporters, and out of options, the Count put the LZ-1 back in its hangar, mothballed. A few months later, a storm whipped across Lake Constance. The hangar was damaged, along with the airship inside it, which was ripped open along a third of its length, severely damaging the aluminium structure. Sometime in 1901, the Count scrapped the LZ-1 and pulled the floating hangar ashore. He let go all his workmen, except for 2 night watchmen to guard the hangar and a young engineer, in the hope that one day he would be able to continue his experiments. In fact, that young engineer would go on to play a hugely significant role in the development of all future Zeppelins. For now, the Count did not know where to turn. He did know one thing. Having finally experienced flight, he was not willing to give up his dream. And interestingly, there had been a perceptible shift in public opinion, in Wurttemberg at least, if not in wider Germany. Before the flights of the LZ-1, von Zeppelin had been openly derided in public as a lunatic, a crazy old man. But now people looked at him in a slightly different light. They appreciated how much he had worked and fought for his vision of airship travel. Locally, they now knew him as der Luftikus am Bodensee, the aerial dreamer down by the lake. I hope you enjoyed this look at Count von Zeppelin's life and early work with airships. Join us next time, where we will continue following his progress as he struggles to raise money to build more airships, and just as it looks like he's about to finally achieve great success with his 4th airship, disaster strikes. Do remember to sign up to the Patreon at www.patreon.com/upshippod. Email the podcast at upshippodcast@gmail.com. You can also find the podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at upshippod. I hope you enjoyed your flight with us today. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, and review. And join me next time for more aerial adventures on Upship, the Airship History Podcast.